Today, I want to talk about someone who I think was basically wrong about basically everything. Usually on this show, or so far on this show, let's say, I've been bringing you people that I admire immensely, bringing you great works of literature and fiction and art that I think belong as titans in the pantheon, to mix metaphors, right? There are gods of Western culture and Western civilization. Today, I want to talk about someone who had a tremendous influence on the West, but who I think was wrong, and that's David Hume, the Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. And I want to spend a second talking a little bit about why I think it's important to bring you people that I disagree with from the Western canon, and what our job is here on this show to just remind us, right? Because I am here giving you the classical education that you are being denied by modern culture. That's the whole point of this show. That's why I love to do it. That's what, I'm here for. That's what I was made for, is to share these incredible ideas that have been passed down throughout the centuries and the generations, and that now can help you to live a higher, deeper, more profound and virtuous life. That's the whole point. The Western tradition is a big tradition. It obviously encompasses an enormous range of people, eras, thoughts, ideas. Not all of those are going to be ones that I think are right. And so I am presenting these things to you from a point of view, right? I can't lie to you about that. I have to be honest about what I believe, what I think, and I've always told you exactly what I think about various ideas, various people. So on the one hand, I'm giving you these ideas from inside the Western tradition, because we're all a part of it, right? We participate in that big conversation. We take authors and we say, well, I agree with this and I don't agree with that. And we kind of incorporate them, try them out in our lives, right? That's a really underrated way of kind of figuring out if something works, is you spend a little time with an author, spend a little time, using his ideas in your life, see if it works. So we're all in that. And we can't, we shouldn't be dishonest about that or try to hide it. But at the same time, right, my job is also to present to you the whole conversation, the whole history, as much as I can, take a bird's eye view. And I would also be dishonest if I were to deny to you people who have been major players in that history. Even if, as I go, I'm going to say to you why I think Hume is wrong about various things, right? But the point is that I'm here giving you the whole thing from a perspective. And that's, the whole job of a classical education, right? That's what we're about. So today I want to really get into David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's sometimes called the first enquiry, came out in 1748. Hume was born in 1711. And this was a major work, became a major work in the history of philosophy. Do you know what annoys me almost as much as bad philosophy? People stealing my data. The people out there who are trying to sell your data do not have your best interests at heart. I've talked about this a lot. I really think it is a crisis. And so when I go online, I use ExpressVPN to keep my data private. It used to be private citizens were just private citizens, and that was that. Now, everything that you've browsed, searched for, watched, tweeted, that can be crawled through and turned basically into a permanent public record. There are hundreds of data brokers out there. Their sole job, their one reason for being, is to sell your data. And they don't have to get your consent to do it either. So when I go online, in order to fix this problem, I use ExpressVPN. It reroutes my connection through an encrypted server. My IP address is masked. The best part is it's incredibly easy to use. Doesn't matter what device you're on, your phone, your laptop, your smart TV. All you have to do is just tap one button and you're protected. Super easy. If you are like me and you think that this is one of the most important things to address today, then go to expressvpn.com and keep your data secure. You can save 35% on a 12-month plan by going to expressvpn.com, expressvpn.com to learn more. Okay, so Hume himself is maybe the most important figure from a period with a lot of really important figures that has become to be called the Scottish Enlightenment. So obviously in Scotland, people like Adam Smith were revolutionizing the way we thought about economics and would do so for, generations to come up to the present day. I mean, this is a time period when a lot of the ideas that we are currently still wrestling with or using or building cities and governments upon, a lot of those ideas were being thought up and discussed. Scotland became a hotbed for this. David Hume was a major figure. He goes to the University of Edinburgh at a very, very young age. He seems to have either been 10 or 12. And he then sort of returns home also at a very young age and spends, long years in deep contemplation of philosophy and, importantly, of a number of other subjects. He was a writer of history, famous in his day for his history, but also a student of the new sciences that were becoming incredibly important during this time. Newton was not that long before Hume. Remember, Hume is born in 1711, and this, even the Copernican revolution, right, overturning the idea of a geocentric universe, the idea that in fact, the Earth revolves around the sun, right? All of these discoveries that people were making that were basically showing that the world was ruled by these forces that actually we can't always see with our eyes, right? That things like gravity exist. I mean, imagine the total mind shift that had to occasion. And it was a time of great optimism about discovering the way the universe worked like a machine, right? That we could look at these things and study them and figure out how the parts and the pieces fit together. And that's an important context here, because one of the things I want to do, even if I disagree with Hume, is show you why what he said looked reasonable, looked like it made sense at the time. And one of the things that was going on is there was this big debate about, well, how do we know things? What kind of beings are we? What's our role in the universe? And if this universe is a kind of machine governed by physical rules that we can study, but which aren't immediately apparent to our eyes, well, then how can we trust our intuitions, our feelings, our ideas? These are the kinds of questions that Hume is taking up. He first really takes them up in a massive work called A Treatise of Human Nature. It comes out between 1739 and 1740, and was hugely disappointing to him in its reception. He said it was born essentially dead from the press. It did not have the impact that he hoped it would, because he is in fact dealing in his what's called his epistemology, that is his philosophy of how we know things, with really radical ideas, especially to do with how much actually can we know, this idea of skepticism that we're going to get into, right? And so he expected, I think, that Treatise of Human Nature would have a much bigger splash. He went away and kind of thought about how to write better. This was a time also of many great essayists, Joseph Addison, William Hazlitt, some of the greatest writers in the English language. And Hume himself became thought of as one of the most important, not the most important, philosophers ever to write in English. So he went away, thought about his style, thought about his communication, and the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which, as I said, comes out in 1748, is basically the fruit of that labor. And that's what we're going to focus on today, because it's basically a distillation, a clarification of his thought. And it inspired a whole bunch of reactions. I mean, Kant devoted a lot of time to refuting it. The German philosopher Kant devoted a lot of time to kind of pushing back on Hume. But eventually, as philosophy got going, a lot of people become much more sympathetic to Hume. As we'll see, a lot of his ideas sort of sound like stuff that we're dealing with now. Like, for example, as I'll argue, he was basically an atheist, and it's kind of unclear. He never comes right out and says that, but he was hugely skeptical about the possibility of reason to understand and predict the universe. And he was hugely skeptical about scripture, received wisdom, received opinion, and inaugurated, in some sense, the idea that philosophy should not be appealing to God as a first source of reason. I mean, even Descartes, the French philosopher, who's known for kind of reducing philosophy to its essentials and just asking, what can I know just if I'm totally alone in the world and I can only sort of pure reason my way out, right? Even Descartes appeals to God in his work. Hume is one of the first philosophers to sort of scrap all of that. So we're going to proceed bit by bit through the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, the first enquiry, and I will make comments as we go about why I think Hume is wrong. You guys, I am really excited about today, because today is the day that my friend Liz Wheeler launches her new show. It's the Liz Wheeler Show. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. They just dropped the first episode. It is fire. It's so cool. One more time, it's the Liz Wheeler show. You probably know Liz. She is a big star in the conservative movement. This show is Liz Wheeler Unchained, because she's not just delivering you the news, she's also telling you what she thinks about it. She pulls absolutely no punches. She is a fierce culture warrior. She's on the offensive, which is so important. Conservatives are on the defensive so much, but Liz is just, does not mince words. This is true of her personally. It is also true of her show, which is produced by the same guys that do this show. So it's great because this show is awesome, right? My producers and my friends, they're at Soundfront. They also do shows like Verdict with Ted Cruz and my other pal, Michael Knowles. So everything that they do is awesome. Liz is awesome. This is going to be a great show. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. Go and hit subscribe so that you make sure you never miss an episode. Highly, highly recommend it. You will be missing out if you do not do this. This is going to be the next big thing in conservative media. All right, now. So the edition I'm using here is the Oxford Philosophical Texts edition. It's edited by Tom L. Beauchamp, I hope that's how he pronounces his name. If not, Tom, if you're listening, I'm sorry. But it's a wonderful edition. It's a scholarly edition, but it presents the text in a pretty clean way. And we're going to start really at the beginning. There's a preface about different species of philosophy and kind of how philosophy works in elite British society that I won't get into, because the core of it is in section 2. He begins with this whole treatment of the origin of ideas, and he starts dividing human, really just mental experiences into 2 major categories. He says, we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into 2 classes or species, which are distinguished by their different degrees of force and vivacity. The less forcible and lively are commonly denominated thoughts or ideas. That's species 1 of experiences that we have in our mind, and this is things like memory, imagination, and as we'll get into, sort of abstract reasoning. The other species want a name in our language and in most others, I suppose because it was not requisite for any but philosophical purposes to rank them under a general term or appellation. Let us therefore use a little freedom and call them impressions, employing that word in a sense somewhat different from the usual. By the term impression, then, I mean all our more lively perceptions, when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. And impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are the less lively perceptions of which we are conscious when we reflect on any of those sensations or movements above mentioned. So the distinction he's making here is kind of like a distinction that has deep roots in Greek philosophy. And that's a distinction between aesthesis, which is where we get our word aesthetics. And that's, not only sense perception, but actually cognitive perception. He says like love is one, right? So when I experience a feeling or a desire for something, and then you might call it noesis or noema, this kind of intellectual abstract perception that's not directly connected to the experience you're having right now. We've talked about different ways to get at this sort of 2-part kind of human experience, but he's saying one of them is less lively, and that's our ideas and our impressions, which are not just our sense perceptions, but are every kind of experience that we're having right now in this moment. Those are our, that's the kind of more lively category. So what he goes on to say is essentially that our ideas are derived from our impressions. That is, they're secondary. The experience that we have right here, right now in the world is the kind of primary thing. It's what in some Greek philosophy, like the Stoic philosophy, which we call the criterion of truth. And everything else is derived. And so this makes Hume what you would call a thoroughgoing empiricist. And now is the first time when we need to know that context of Newtonian physics and science being really important here, because there were people who would have argued at this time that some of our ideas are kind of baked in a priori, like our idea of God, for example, or of morality. These things, even if you never encountered anybody, even if you lived in a cave or raised by wolves, you would be able to kind of reason these things out without ever having had an experience of virtue, say, or of God. And Hume says, no, that's not true. You can only derive your ideas, even your sort of abstract idea of a cat. You can only derive them by having those experiences first, and you can't just kind of magic them out of thin air. And that's in contrast to this hyper-rationalist idea of the world. So there already, we can sympathize with him, right? We don't in fact just imagine the world and then find that it perfectly conforms to our imagination. We do have to go out and test things empirically, but he goes, I think, way too far in the other direction. He makes two arguments for why your ideas are only ever derived from your direct perception. This can be really important for example, his argument against traditional religious views. He says to prove this, that is to prove that our ideas come from our impressions, the following two arguments will, I hope, be sufficient. First, when we analyze our thoughts or ideas, however compounded or sublime, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment. Even those ideas which at first seem the most wide of this origin are found upon nearer scrutiny to be derived from it. The idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom. I want to pause here on just this first argument because if you blink, you'll miss it, but this is hugely important for modernity. He's saying that we get our idea of God by basically magnifying the experiences that we have of good and wise and virtuous in the world. And so God is basically on this, he doesn't come out and say this, but God is basically a figment of our imagination. Now you get this everywhere. You get it in Freud, for example, right? That God is basically Sky Daddy that we invent because we have a real dad and we kind of, make him the best dad ever, right? The first thing that I want to point out here is that this is an article of faith. Hume helps himself to it. He doesn't know anything more about the origin of that idea than you do. And it sounds like he does because he's being kind of a hard-nosed empiricist, right? But you've never encountered an actual human with no, experience of anything in the world. And furthermore, we have no way of knowing whether our sort of less direct, less physical experiences are actually another faculty beyond just the sort of direct sensory experiences that we have. So you could say, yeah, these are just figments of our imagination. You could say this is a dimmer kind of perception that we work gradually toward. And Hume basically just comes down on helps himself to one version of that. So that's the first note that I want to make, because I think it's important to catch philosophers up when they just make these claims that sound very wise because they sound kind of hard-nosed and realist, right? But are they actually? I mean, it's an article of faith, I think, just as much as the opposite would be. So here's his second argument. He says, if it happen from a defect of the organ that a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we always find that he is as little susceptible of the correspondent ideas. A blind man can form no notion of colors, a deaf man of sounds. Restore either of them that sense in which he is deficient. By opening this new inlet for his sensations, you also open an inlet for the ideas. Now, this is a more powerful argument. And what he's saying is basically, you can't imagine color. Blind people can't imagine color. So we know that even though color is an idea, that is, it's a kind of more abstracted notion that we have in our head, even if we imagine it, but it's not the same thing as seeing blue directly. And so he's saying if you don't have that direct sensory perception, if you don't have that impression, then you can't get the idea, and you can only get the idea from having the impression. This is a fair argument, right? He goes on to undercut it himself, but not acknowledge that. So here's the next part, and I'm going to take from Hume the argument against Hume here. He says, there is, however, one contradictory phenomenon which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise independent of their correspondent impressions. I believe it will readily be allowed that the several distinct ideas of color which enter by the eye or those of sound which are conveyed by the ear are really different from each other, though at the same time resembling. Now, if this be true of different colors, it must be no less so of the different shades of the same color, and each shade produces a distinct idea independent of the rest. He's going somewhere with this. He's saying you see all these different shades of blue, right? If this should be denied, it is possible by the continual gradation of shades to run a color insensibly into what is most remote from it. And if you will not allow any of the means to be different, you cannot, without absurdity, deny the extremes to be the same. Suppose, therefore, a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years and to have become perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance, which it has never been his fortune to meet with. Let all the different shades of that color, except that single one, be placed before him, descending gradually from the deepest to the lightest. It is plain that he will perceive a blank where that shade is wanting, and will be sensible that there is a greater distance in that place between the contiguous colors than in any other. He's saying if you could see all shades of blue except one, you would be able to tell that there was a shade missing, that there was some gap in between this shade of blue and that slightly darker shade of blue. Now I ask whether it be possible for him from his own imagination to supply this deficiency and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses. I believe there are few, but will be of opinion that he can. So he concedes that you could imagine a blue that you had never seen if you had seen all the other blues. And this may serve as proof that the simple ideas are not always in every instance derived from the correspondent impressions. Hang on for a second, right? That's God, right? God exactly is the thing that we perceive in the world that is missing from it. C.S. Lewis says if you are hungry and you're alone on a desert island, it makes sense that, you would not have any bread, but it wouldn't make sense that there would be no such thing as bread. When we have a hunger, it suggests that there is something which answers that hunger. God is the thing for which all our hungers are. He is the shade of blue that we know has to be there because we see the rest of the world. We see things like goodness and virtue. We intuit that there is absolute goodness and absolute virtue on the basis of our, derived experience, right? Our quote unquote lived experience of the world suggests to us, right, that there is some shade of blue, some highest good at the top of our perception. So what's Hume's answer to this? I'll tell you in a second. Now, I am told that Father's Day is coming up, and I have some bald guy who constantly claims to be related to me, so I guess I had better get him a present. And if you also have a father that you have not yet bought a gift for Father's Day, go to youngheretics.com/shop, and you will find the perfect merch for dads. There's Young Heretics shirts, there's We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirts. You can get all of it 15% off if you use the code FATHER at checkout. This ends on June 20th. So head over there now, youngheretics.com/shop, use the code FATHER at checkout, and get your dad looking fly. Okay. Hume's answer to this big gap in his argument is, this may serve as proof that the simple ideas are not always in every instance derived from the correspondent impressions, though this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth observing and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. He just shrugs it off, right? He just moves along. So all that I'm trying to convey to you here, in addition to trying to explain to you what Hume's argument is, why he's making it, what I'm trying to convey to you is that these are articles of faith. These are things that he just sort of lays claim to. And because we are primed, I think, especially in a hyper-scientific age, to accept things that to kind of debunk stuff like, the Freudian debunking of myth as kind of like invention out of culture and out of experience. We're primed to accept those things as cooler, as sort of more sophisticated than the old traditional faith. But they're no better argued for. In fact, they're, in Hume, I would say, worse argued for than the premises of traditional belief. Okay, that's just the beginning, right? So this is, but let's grant Hume his distinction between impression and thought, between experience in the world and the kind of ideas that we derive from that experience. And let's say that, if we grant him that all ideas are derived from that experience, where does he want to take that, right? Why is he arguing this? What follows from it? Well, the first big thing, and this is something that Hume is kind of known for, the first big thing is that one idea we have, which is not actually anywhere to be found in our direct impression of things, is causation. The idea that if I hold a book or a pencil or something up in the air and I let it go, letting it go will cause it to fall. Does this sound familiar? It's Newton, right? I mean, he's arguing here with Newton, essentially, who has said, well, I observe the falling of the book, and from this, I Newton performed this brilliant act of sort of reasoning that allowed him to predict that the book would continue to fall. And why would it continue to fall? Well, because there are forces of gravity that draw masses towards one another, all these things, right? Hume basically wants to say there is nothing in your perception which implies that that thing will keep happening. And this is basically an extreme degree of skepticism about the rationality of the universe. That he's saying Newton just takes for granted that the universe will keep behaving the way it's behaved in the past, but we have nothing in our direct experience of the universe to make us believe that. So let me read a passage in which he argues for this idea. He says, "To convince us that all the laws of nature and all the operations of bodies without exception are known only by experience, the following reflections may perhaps suffice. Were any object presented to us, and were we required to pronounce concerning the effect which will result from it, without consulting past observation, after what manner, I beseech you, must the mind proceed in this operation? It must invent or imagine some event, which it ascribes to the object as its effect, and it is plain that this invention must be entirely arbitrary." He's saying there's nothing inherent in your experience of the book, in your experience of my hand, that suggests, if you've never seen anything like it happened before, that suggests the book is going to fall when I let it go. So he says the mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball, he's talking about balls on a pool table that bounce off each other as examples of cause and effect, right? Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest the smallest hint of the other. A stone or piece of metal raised into the air and left without any support immediately falls. But to consider the matter a priori, is there anything we discover in this situation which can beget an idea of a downward rather than an upward, or any other motion in the stone or metal? So he's pointing to something that is genuinely curious, right? Which is that we have this kind of intuition, this just natural inclination to assume that things are going to behave in a rational and a logical way. That, that this kind of behavior in the universe will repeat itself under the same kinds of circumstances. If you perform the action of dropping a book once, and then you do the same exact thing with nothing else different, right, then the book will drop again. This is the very basis of the scientific method. We have this sort of intuition that that works. And not only that it works in this particular case, but that if you can see the rules that are at play, then you can basically extrapolate them out. You can apply them to other experiences, other things that have mass will also fall to the ground, right? So he's attacking here the very foundations of how we reason about science, right? And he's saying, where do we get this idea? It's not from any experience or impression that we have. We just kind of, pluck it out of our nature, out of our intuition. So here's where he thinks we get the idea of causation, and then I'm going to pause again to argue with him. So he says, suppose that someone has acquired experience and has lived so long in the world as to have observed similar objects or events to be constantly conjoined together. What is the consequence of this experience? He immediately infers the existence of one object from the appearance of the other, yet he has not, by all his experience, acquired any idea or knowledge of the secret power by which the one object produces the other. Nor is it by any process of reasoning he is engaged to draw this inference, but he still finds himself determined to draw it. And though he should be convinced that his understanding has no part in the operation, he would nevertheless continue in the same course of thinking. There is some other principle which determines him to form such a conclusion, that is, the conclusion that cause and effect are linked with each other, that effect follows after cause, right? He says, what is the principle which determines one to form such a conclusion? The principle is custom or habit, for wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. He's saying that basically we are taught this by our society, by convention, by repetition. By employing that word, we pretend not to have given the ultimate reason of such propensity. We only point out a principle of human nature, which is universally acknowledged and which which is well known by its effects, perhaps we can push our enquiries no farther, or pretend to give the cause of this cause, but must rest contented with it as the ultimate principle, which we can assign of all our conclusions from experience. It is sufficient satisfaction that we can go so far without repining at the narrowness of our faculties, because they will carry us no farther. So he's basically saying, well, there are things going on in human nature and in the world that we are not given to know and understand. And again, there, I'm very sympathetic to him, right? His skepticism about this is in some part a reaction against the idea that everything can be gamed out like a machine, that human reason has this total power to understand everything. And I've argued against that idea before on the show. So Hume and I are in agreement about that. But again, I just want to point this out to you, right? That he observes, first of all, the fact that we have this idea which does not come to us from our experience, but that seems to be kind of baked into our brains, that custom and habit and human nature sort of incline us to expect that the rules of the universe will work in a logical and rational way, and that when we use our reason to predict what will happen on the basis of that previous experience, that will continue to happen, that cause and effect will continue to work, right? And he basically says, well, we just get that out of our nature. And that's an idea, but it doesn't actually correspond to any real impression. But isn't that sort of curious? I mean, if you think about it, right? Cause and effect do obtain. They do exist. Things do continue to behave in rational ways. Physics works, right? We drop the book, we learn about gravity, and then we drop the book again, right? And so it turns out that this human nature idea that we have in our gut, in our brains, wherever you want to put it, right? That Hume thinks has no basis in its sort of our empirical understanding. It turns out that idea is true, right? And so if it's true, then maybe, right, baked into us, there's some, there's some kind of thing, some reason, right, that corresponds to the natural world and that the natural world answers to. What I'm getting to here is that's the God-shaped hole, right? Remember when I talked about the shade of blue that you could infer was there if you saw all the other shades of blue, right? The God-shaped hole is, why do our minds do this, right? Hume is raising exactly the right question. Why do our minds develop these ideas of cause and effect? And why do those ideas of cause and effect continue to hold good, right? But he's missing the answer that's staring him in the face, right? I mean, this is the God-shaped hole in the universe. Have we ever seen God? No, nobody has ever seen God. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard. But we use our process of inference, just like we would imagine that color blue, right? To posit that there is a reason in us because there is a reason in the universe. You guys, I love being in contact with you through this show so much. I love the community that we've built. I do not want it to be blitzed out of the air by big tech. And at this point, anything that you say or do can cause big tech to just zap you off the internet. If you do not want to lose touch with me, with this show, go to youngheretics.com and drop your email in our email list. That way I can keep in contact with you no matter what, and nobody will get in the way. One more time, it's youngheretics.com. Drop your email and beat big tech. Okay, so stopping once again to give Hume his conclusions, to let him have the thing that I disagree with that he's just said, right? Let's imagine that he's right and that causation is just a kind of thing that exists in our natures and we have nothing more to say about it than that, right? From this proceed a whole bunch of incredibly controversial and shocking conclusions. The first one that I'm going to get to is that there basically is no free will. And this was a very live debate in the 18th century. I mean, it's always an issue in philosophy. It goes back, some would argue, to the Nicomachean Ethics and to Aristotle's idea of the voluntary, right? But this is becoming hugely important in the 18th century. Why? Because again, the universe seems to behave according to these mathematical principles and particles bouncing off each other. And if that's all there is, right, if these rules are all predictable, and if we are also made of particles, doesn't it just stand to reason that we don't have any free will because those particles continue basically to behave as we expect them to? Hume has a kind of kooky argument about this. He begins with a shocking kind of optimism. I mean, he really is a child of the Scottish Enlightenment, even though in many ways he's contending with a lot of people. But he begins with this very Enlightenment optimism that, oh, this has been a big argument, but it's just a misunderstanding, and I'm going to set the whole thing aright. So that's how this chapter begins on liberty and necessity. In the lead up to this chapter, he sort of examines what you might call the root or the rudiment of our idea of free will, and that is the idea that when we think, if we're healthy and if we're blessed to have a functioning body and brain, then, you think, I want to raise my hand, and it does, right? It raises. And so he's saying, well, this is basically the root of our idea that we have free will, that we can just choose. If I chose not to raise my hand, I would. And Hume says, it appears that this idea of a necessary connection among events arises from a number of similar instances which occur of the constant conjunction of these events, nor can that idea ever be suggested by any one of these instances surveyed in all possible lights and positions. But there is nothing in a number of instances different from every single instance which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant, and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. So he's saying in all cases, not just the case of, the human mind operating the human body, or however you want to put it, but just in all cases, when we see one thing follow another again and again and again, then we create this idea of necessary connection. There's nothing inherent in our perception or our experiences that teaches us that, but we come to rely on it. It's just by our nature. And so the idea is that same thought can be applied to the way that you behave in the world, that, you have a thought, and the thought is, I'm going to raise my hand. And then your hand raises. And the more that happens, the more you come to believe that, in fact, your thoughts are controlling your hand. But again, right, how do you know that? And this is at the base of a lot of contradiction of free will, right? That our direct experience is of raising our hand by our own will. But Hume is basically saying there's nothing in that experience except its repetition that makes you feel that way. Now, I've already argued that that's not right? I mean, we have this intuition not only that this particular experience makes sense, but that we can extrapolate. That is, we can take that experience and apply it outward. And when we do, we turn out to be right? We get confirmation back from the world that this idea is not merely a one-off that just happens to be happening right now. But leave that aside, right? How does he apply this to free will more generally? Well, he writes, it would seem that men begin at the wrong end of this question concerning liberty and necessity, liberty being free will, necessity being fate or just, determinism, when they enter upon it by examining the faculties of the soul, the influence of the understanding, and the operations of the will. Let them first discuss a more simple question, namely the operations of body and of brute unintelligent matter, and try whether they can there form any idea of causation and necessity, except that of a constant conjunction of objects, and subsequent inference of the mind from one to another. If these circumstances form in reality the whole of that necessity which we conceive in matter, and if these circumstances be also universally acknowledged to take place in the operations of the mind, the dispute is at an end, at least must be owned to be thenceforth merely verbal. So he's saying it's if you accept the premise that matter causes things to happen to other matter, and that sense of cause is basically just the stipulation that this thing happens and then this thing happens and then this thing happens and these events follow one another and that's all we have to say about them. He's saying if you apply that consistently everywhere, that's just human behavior also, because human nature dictates that people behave in certain ways, and you can predict on the basis of somebody's nature what they're going to do, just the same way that you can predict that the book is going to fall when you let it go. Why? Because you've seen this happen a bunch of times. Choleric people that tend to be angry, get angry very quickly. These things, ultimately, if you knew all the rules, well, then you could predict what was going to happen. And so this is where we start to get this weird thing where Hume seems to be saying that everything is, anything could happen in the next 5 minutes. Totally against the laws of physics. I could start levitating up off this chair. And yet it seems as if ultimately, because he believes that causation is just things that tend to happen again and again, he keeps arguing basically that things do happen again and again with no deviation from one another. So he basically destroys the idea of free will using this argument. He says, as long as we will rashly suppose that we have some farther idea of necessity and causation in the operations of external objects, at the same time that we can find nothing farther in the voluntary actions of the mind, there is no possibility of bringing the question to any determinate issue while we proceed upon so erroneous a supposition. The only method of undeceiving us is to mount up higher, to examine the narrow extent of science when applied to material causes, and to convince ourselves that all we know of them is the constant conjunction and inference above mentioned. We may perhaps find that it is with difficulty we are induced to fix such narrow limits to human understanding, but we can afterwards find no difficulty when we come to apply this doctrine to the actions of the will. For as it is evident that these have a regular conjunction with motives and circumstances and characters, and as we always draw inferences from one to the other, we must be obliged to acknowledge in words that necessity which we have already avowed in every deliberation of our lives and in every step of our conduct and behavior. This, too, comes to us straight out of the Enlightenment, the idea that if we apply a certain set of reasons and ideas to the material world, to the way that atoms bounce off one another, to the way that billiard balls bounce off one another, to the way that books fall, and if we take that logic, we must apply it to all the rest of our life and experience. Now, there's no, again, that's an article of faith. There's no reason to do it that way. The Greeks, who were great natural scientists, didn't do it that way. Hume, being a child of the Enlightenment, does it that way. And because what he has to say about the natural world is that it's just a series of events that follow one after the other, and we basically, infer that there is a cause when certain events continue to follow after the other over and over again, well, then we say that human nature, human interaction always behaves according to certain patterns. There is no such thing as free will. I want to now revisit this idea that the skepticism which says anything could happen actually ends up saying that the same thing is going to happen all the time, because we have no way of understanding or knowing anything except what just keeps happening again and again. This really comes out when Hume makes his argument against miracles, and especially against the sort of modern day miracles that are reported, especially in sort of small towns and remote rural localities. He takes up this question whether miracles occur. And he says, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. In such conclusions as are founded on an infallible experience, he expects the event with the last degree of assurance and regards his past experience as a full proof of the future existence of that event. And he's saying if all the proof you have is that things tend to happen a certain way, and if you've experienced something that fits into that pattern, that's it. You've had that experience. It's the full proof of the future existence of that event. In other cases, he proceeds with more caution. He weighs the opposite experiments. He considers which side is supported by the greater number of experiments. To that side he inclines with doubt and hesitation, and when at last he fixes his judgment, the evidence exceeds not what we properly call probability. So he's basically saying if we're unsure how things tend to behave, well, then we weigh circumstances and events against one another. What does this mean? Well, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Why is it more than probable that all men must die, that lead cannot of itself remain suspended in the air, that fire consumes wood and is extinguished by water, unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and there is required a violation of these laws, or in other words, a miracle to prevent them? Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happened in the common course of nature. It is no miracle that a man, seemingly in good health, should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life. We've read this in the Gospels, right? That a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. Otherwise, the event would not merit that appellation. So we started out by saying, well, we don't know what will happen tomorrow if I drop this book 20 times. Maybe the next time I drop it, it'll float up into the air. But it turns out that all that gives us to go on is what we've already experienced. So it becomes a closed system. You can then only say that things happen in the way that you've experienced them happening before. So even though this seems like something that blows open the doors of what could be, when he gets to arguing about miracles, right, it turns out he's actually exploded the possibility of anything happening except what we've experienced happening in the past. So he makes this little concession for Scripture because we believe in Scripture by faith, right? But basically, in terms of the logic of his argument, right, it seems as if he's liberating us from belief in superstition. What he's actually doing is locking us into this rigid pre-existing system of just what we've experienced in the past, what the whole mass of mankind has experienced in the past, which destroys the possibility of reason altogether, right? Because if indeed there is that color blue, I keep coming back at the beginning of his argument to that color blue, right, that we can infer might exist, but we could never ever have evidence of it because we've never experienced it, right? He basically just, cuts his argument out from underneath himself. There are a lot of people in the history of philosophy who are suspected of atheism. That is, people will argue that, oh, well, Newton said he believed, but really, if he could have been free to say in this era without persecution, he would have said, no, actually, I don't believe. This happens all the time. You hear people make this statement basically on the basis of nothing, basically just like, it sort of seems like this person was very smart and, everybody had to believe back then, but if he could have, he wouldn't have believed. So I want to say at the outset that argument really is sort of silly a lot of the times it gets made. In the case of Hume, it's pretty clearly true. He's pretty clearly undermining the rudiments of our possibility of belief in God, in traditional religion. And you can see him doing this in the next chapter, which, unlike the rest of the book, is framed as this imaginary dialogue with a friend, and the friend pretends to be speaking in Athens and pretends to be Epicurus, right? And so he's basically distancing himself from this next part because it's the most incendiary. It basically undercuts the whole idea of belief in God. Before I get to reading it, I want to point out, right, that Hume was no dummy, and there's a reason why he puts this in the mouth of Epicurus. Because Epicurus, right, was the one who lived also in a scientific era, in an era when people were investigating natural phenomena. And Epicurus was the one who was saying, well, just because things happen this way in this world, well, there might be any number of other worlds in which things happen differently. And you notice, interestingly, that people have to invent this multiverse theory in order to deny the things that I'm saying, right? That basically, the fact that our world behaves in a sort of rational way, and the fact that our minds seem able to understand the rational order of the world suggests that there's more than mere accident here, that there's some kind of design. And in order to get out of that, you basically have to say that somewhere out there, right, the world doesn't behave this way. That's what Epicurus says. That's what Hume has his friends say on behalf, basically, of himself to make an argument about God and whether God exists. So in this imaginary argument, the Athenians have accused Epicurus of a kind of impiety. And Epicurus, that is Hume's friend, that is Hume, says, "You who are my accusers have acknowledged that the chief or sole argument for a divine existence, which I never questioned, is derived from the order of nature, where there appear such marks of intelligence and design that you think it extravagant to assign for its cause either chance or the blind and unguided force of matter." So he's saying basically that the Athenians make the same argument I just made and have been making this whole time, right? That the rational order of things suggests that things work out this way. "You allow that this is an argument drawn from effects to causes. From the order of the work, you infer that there must have been project and forethought in the workman. If you cannot make out this point, you allow that your conclusion fails, and you pretend not to establish the conclusion in a greater latitude than the phenomena of nature will justify. These are your concessions. I desire you to mark the consequences." So he's saying, take this premise. Now here's Hume now arguing basically back with me as Epicurus, is when we infer any particular cause from an effect, we must proportion the one to the other and can never be allowed to ascribe to the cause any qualities but what are exactly sufficient to produce the effect. A body of 10 ounces raised in any scale may serve as a proof that the counterbalancing weight exceeds 10 ounces, but can never afford a reason that it exceeds 100. If the cause assigned for any effect be not sufficient to produce it, it, we must either reject that cause or add to it such qualities as will give it a just proportion to the effect. But if we ascribe to it farther qualities or affirm it capable of producing other effects, we can only indulge the license of conjecture and arbitrarily suppose the existence of qualities and energies without reason or authority. Allowing, therefore, the gods to be the authors of the existence or order of the universe, it follows that they possess that precise degree of power, intelligence, and benevolence which appears in their workmanship, but nothing farther can ever be proved except we call in the existence of exaggeration and flattery to supply the defects of argument and reasoning. So far as the traces of any attributes at present appear, so far may we conclude these attributes to exist. The supposition of farther attributes is mere hypothesis, much more the suspicion that in distant regions of space or periods of time there has been or will be a more magnificent display of these attributes, and a scheme of administration more suitable to such imaginary virtues. We can never be allowed to mount up from the universe, the effect, to Jupiter, the cause, and then descend downward to infer any new effect from that cause. So Hume is arguing against everything that I have just been saying, right? That the universe doesn't actually fit together in the way that we would assume it does if God is all virtuous, all reasoning, all just, right? And so in fact, even if we say that the universe has to have been created, we don't have any reason to insist that the universe was created by a good God. Why do I disagree with this? Well, I agree with Hume up to this point, right? That God must, in order for us to believe in God, we must believe that the world is not presently as God intended it to be. He's basically, what Hume is doing here is he's using what Christians would call the fall to say your idea of a good and rational, just God is just that. It's just an idea that you've sort of ballooned up outward from your idea that good and virtue and things like that exist, right? And he's saying, but the universe doesn't give evidence for that. Now, I agree that the universe does not give conclusive evidence for that, and that if you are going to look at the universe, you have to posit that it's fallen, it's broken because of all the terrible things that happen. What I've been arguing is that Hume's very observation that the universe behaves more rationally than we think it should, that in fact, even though we can't make any argument why cause and effect should continue to work, they do continue to work, right? That very thing suggests that God is more rational and more good and more providential than the universe itself currently suggests to us. That's why Christians posit the fall to begin with. And all I'm trying to say is that Hume's suggestion that there's no greater weight on the scale than that 10 pounds, right? Hume's idea that all you can say is what you currently see in front of you, that's an article of faith too, because there could be 11 pounds, there could be 12 pounds on the scale, right? And I've been arguing that the evidence suggests that there may in fact be a God on that side of the scale, and all Hume is doing is just taking it on faith that that's not the case. Don't be hoodwinked by hyper-sophisticated people who make arguments that debunk things just for the sake of debunking them. All of that having been said, I want to reiterate, right, that this is part of the Western tradition, right? Me getting in here and mixing it up with David Hume, while I hope representing Hume accurately to you, reading passages of Hume, right, incorporating him into the great conversation, the great tradition, that's what we're about. And even the stuff right now that seems like such a crisis, right? All this fighting over wokeness, all of this, American decadence, that's part of this argument, this conversation that we're having too. We're in a fight for our lives. We're fighting for the West right now, right? But we're in that just as much as we are observing it going on, right? Remember when I talked about Raphael and his painting of theology in the Stanza della Segnatura? It was this big, almost physical fist fight over the real presence of God in the Eucharist. And there were these different clerics on different side of things, right? Doing a tug of war, but over it all stood the Trinity, right? And presiding over the entire thing. And so it's important, right, to be engaging with these philosophers that, are titans. Hume has had a much bigger influence than I've ever had in my life, right? And it was, as I've said here, he basically revolutionized how we think about things, I think for the worse, right? But it's exhilarating. It's exhilarating to get in the ring with these people and to hone your own ideas. I hope I'm doing that by example here, and I hope that you will go away and read people like Hume who are undeniably part of the West, because we're all in this. Every one of us who believes in that great conversation, who understands himself to be participating in that conversation. Every one of us is in this fight, even through and in the disagreements that we have. Now, I concede that we do also have enemies who want to destroy the Western tradition. I think that these woke racialists who want basically to tear down everything just in the name of this creed, right? I mean, they recently abolished the classical languages, the Greek and Latin requirement at Princeton, because it's somehow racist to expect that everybody should be able to know the subject that they're studying, right? I agree. Those people aren't in that fight with us. We are actively, I believe, trying to oppose those people by revitalizing this tradition. But there is room, huge room in this tradition to be fighting and arguing with one another. And just because the people who followed on after Hume, I think, really made some big mistakes, just because I think Hume made some big mistakes, does not mean he is not part of this. Okay, that's Hume for today. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me from VIPs on Locals. If you are not on Locals, I really would invite you to come join us there. What it is it's a community of people on a platform run by Dave Rubin, who is my pal, whom I trust, and who we know is a crusader for freedom of speech. And as big tech is cracking down, as we're all getting zapped off the internet in all these different ways, they can snap their fingers, right? And you're gone off of Twitter. And then how do I find you, right? How do we continue and form this incredible connection? Even this podcast, right? How does this podcast exist if it doesn't exist, in these places that are basically curated by increasingly woke, crazy people? Well, the answer to that is Locals. The Young Heretics VIPs on Locals get all of this extra stuff, and we enter more deeply together into the great conversation that I've been talking about. Hashing arguments out, thinking about things. I write articles that you can only get there, and then people comment and we discuss other people's articles. And then there's also a lifestyle component to it. Because this is more than just ideas in a jar, brains in a jar. This is also, how do we live? What is the good life? And so, I was just posting some workout tips yesterday and a little message also for Memorial Day. So you can get all of that, and also, live Q&As and live streams if you go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP. Recommend the annual version, which is $56. That's 4 months free, because the monthly version is $7 a month. But if you pay for the whole year, you get $56, which is 4 months free. youngheretics.com/locals. And the other thing you can do if you're a VIP is be in the mailbag. And we also even have video questions if you want to be on the show on YouTube. And that's what we have today. We have a video mailbag question from Chad. Take it away.
Hey, Spencer. I was really inspired by your interview that you did recently on The Closed Read. My question is, as part of the West is continuing to grow and continuing to adapt and to morph and to be better than we have been in the past. And I think that there are things that we can absolutely learn from Eastern culture. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are on what can we learn from the East and from Eastern tradition and from sort of that Asian heritage that happens. What can we bring of that to the West so that we can continue to grow and be better and foster a better society?
So I wanted to address this question today because we were talking all episode about things, people that, we maybe disagree with, people that are not the same as us, that nevertheless we can learn a great amount from and that we can incorporate into our sort of understanding of ourselves as Westerners. I think that Eastern philosophy especially, but of course Eastern cultures more generally, can have a similar kind of role to play. And, look, the East is just as enormous a concept as the West, right? And as we've learned on this show, the West means many nations and many different people with differing ideas, but an ongoing recognizable tradition of people conversing with one another. And I share that tradition, that Western tradition, with you for two reasons. One, because I know more about it, right? And this is what I've devoted my life to, is studying these things and loving them and reading these texts. But two, because it's mine. Right. And there is something natural, as we talked about Burke, there's something natural about loving what is yours, about doing things the way you were brought up and changing those things even within that tradition, right? Having a way of reforming that doesn't just completely scrap the whole project. You're never going to magic yourself into some other place, right? You're always going to have a particular story, a particular history. And by the way, that includes people who, who immigrated, for example, to America, right? They become part of that story. And now forever, right? You are part of that story. But of course, that means that you bring stuff from outside. And there are a number of texts that have really influenced my thinking that are obviously not Western texts. The Tao Te Ching, for example, is a kind of, I'm not even sure exactly how to describe it. It's wisdom philosophy, it's wisdom literature, it's poetry. And it's a meditative reflection upon the oneness of all things. And I think there's, when we talked about T.S. Eliot, about his studies of Sanskrit and of Buddhism and his incorporation of certain insights, right, which are universal. Because of course, not every insight is culture bound and culture determined. Every culture ever, for example, has had some idea of a morality beyond just the here and now, something that transcends our material experience. And we can learn a great deal by reading the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which is a kind of ecstatic vision of that, divine order in the universe. We can learn a huge amount from reading haikus, I think. Basho is a poet whom I admire enormously, even in translation, which I'm sure he must lose a lot in translation. Nevertheless, right, this kind of meditative experience of connecting with the oneness of all things, which kind of, I think, counterbalances the hyper-individualist streak in at least modern Western philosophy. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time really, digging into Eastern philosophy and tradition on this show, only because I don't consider myself qualified to do that. And in keeping with my commitment to honesty with you, right, I'm always trying to bring you stuff that I actually know about, that I've thought about, that I've read. And I don't think that, just being an outsider, I'm not sure that I could authoritatively pronounce on work like the Tao Te Ching. But I completely agree with you, Chad, that there is something, especially now that we can be reminded, as we're losing grasp of a lot of our own traditions and commitment to family, right? The Confucian tradition, which is kind of like the Stoic idea of oikeiosis, as I understand it, this commitment to to your local tribe that then expands outward into a commitment to your nation, right? These sorts of things can be, we can be reminded of them from outside, and we certainly, just being nationalists and being lovers of the West does not have to make us haters of other nations or cultures, right? I mean, this is one of the great lies about loving your nation and loving your culture, is that means you hate other nations and other cultures. It doesn't mean that. It just means that you are who you are, right? And you want to know first how you do things at home. And then as you reach out, you can have a certain basis from which to do that reaching out, and from which to say, well, yes, I agree with this, I don't agree with that, but we can still get along, we can still be friends, all these things, right? So I hope that helps answer your question, Chad. Thank you for it. Thanks for being a Young Heretics VIP. I will see you on Locals. One more time, if you're not on Locals, you should get on it. It's youngheretics.com/locals. All right. Thanks for listening and watching. This has been a joy, as always. If you like this show, you can visit the Claremont Institute, where I work, where I think you will love a lot of the writing that we do there. At the Claremont Review of Books, which is our physical paper quarterly review of books, you will actually find in the latest issue a positive, much more positive assessment of David Hume than I have just given. To my point that different people, right, engage differently with different authors, right? So you can go there to find another take on David Hume, but also a bunch of other stuff about the great ideals and traditions of the American founding. Also at AmericanMind.org, you will find our online publication where we do more regular content and stuff that is a little bit more edgy and engaged with the moment. If you would like to donate to our project, I highly suggest that you do. It's claremont.org/donate, and let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. Thank you for being here. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.